Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into some pretty heavy stuff, and it's something that I think, well, it's touched so many lives.
Yeah.
Suicide. I mean, it's not just one event,
Yeah,
right? It's this whole complex crisis
Absolutely.
that we see, throughout history, across every demographic you can think of.
Yeah.
It's kind of woven into, the fabric of being human,
It is. It really is. And that's why we're doing this deep dive, to try to unpack this from every angle we can.
Yeah.
We've got this AI analysis, which has looked at the biological stuff, the psychology, social factors, even environmental things. And the goal here isn't just to throw information at you.
Right.
It's to really understand what leads someone to that point, those hidden complexities.
Exactly. And so for our listeners, I think what you can expect today is to really explore these effects of suicide on individuals, on society as a whole. We're going to go way back in time, look at history, and even touch on some, I think, unexpected connections to things like philosophy and physics, even math and logic, to try to give you a much broader, more nuanced view of this.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's start personally, at the individual level. When you were looking at this AI analysis, what really stood out to you about the impact of suicide on someone's physical health?
It's fascinating because there's this two-way street that the AI highlights.
Oh, interesting.
It's not just, mental anguish leading to these thoughts.
Right.
It really shows how things like if someone has a chronic illness or they're dealing with constant pain or a disability,
Okay.
that can really wear down their hope,
Yeah.
their sense of well-being,
Nice.
and that makes them more vulnerable. And then on the flip side, which we can't forget,
Yeah.
suicide attempts often have their own huge physical consequences. I mean, lasting injuries, chronic health issues. It's like this cycle of suffering that's so important to recognize.
That's such a good point.
Yeah.
Because it's not just the mental part, right? The physical burden, it's both a cause and an effect.
Exactly.
So let's talk about the mental side. We always hear about mental illness and suicide being linked.
Of course.
What were some of the specific things the AI brought up about that?
It really reinforced just how central mental health disorders are
Okay.
as risk factors. Things like major depression, all sorts of anxiety disorders, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia,
Wow.
personality disorders, substance use disorders. All of these were super strong indicators. And what's really powerful is how these conditions actually change the way someone thinks. They change how they handle emotions, even their ability to make clear decisions.
That makes sense.
And this creates a vulnerability you might not see from the outside. So it's not just feeling sad, it's like the whole structure of your thinking and feeling is different.
So it's not just like a bad day kind of thing.
No, not
It's
yet.
like a fundamental shift.
Exactly.
Okay, so beyond those specific disorders, let's talk pure emotions. What kind of intense feelings come up a lot in this analysis?
The AI really lays out this whole cluster of powerful negative emotions that tend to come before suicidal thoughts. You have the obvious ones like deep sadness, and then this feeling of just pervasive hopelessness and despair.
Yeah.
But it goes deeper. There's guilt, this intense shame, anger that's often misdirected, and just profound loneliness. And what's crucial is how big life events like a trauma, a loss, a really difficult relationship, those connect as triggers. They take these already powerful emotions and they just ratchet them up to this level where it feels unbearable.
I can't even imagine. And when you're in that much emotional pain,
Yeah.
Clear thinking has got to be tough.
Yeah.
How does suicidal ideation actually mess with how our brains work cognitively?
That's exactly it.
Oh.
The AI points to these cognitive distortions that are so common when someone's having these thoughts, like black and white thinking, everything's extreme, no middle ground, or catastrophizing, always expecting the worst possible thing to happen.
Right.
And then just this deep, deep hopelessness, believing nothing will ever get better.
Wow.
And what's really key is that their problem-solving abilities just plummet.
Oh, interesting.
The mental energy they'd usually use to find solutions is just eaten up by this inner struggle, making it so much harder to see a way out of the pain.
It's almost like their internal problem-solving system is overloaded.
Exactly.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so we've got these internal things happening. Are there also behavioral changes that someone close to them might notice?
For sure. The analysis points to some warning signs, things that people around the individual might pick up on.
Okay, like what?
Like withdrawing socially, pulling away from their usual friends, activities, maybe suddenly taking more risks, or they start talking about death a lot, even giving away things they love, like they're preparing to be gone.
Oh, wow.
Even changes in basic things, their sleep, how much they're eating. Yeah. Those can be red flags. Now, none of these alone mean for sure, but when you see several together, it should definitely raise concern.
These are so important for all of us to be aware of, just in our daily lives.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's zoom out a bit. We've talked individual.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the wider social level.
Okay.
How does suicide hit families and close relationships?
This is where you really see the ripple effects. The impact on those loved ones is it's profound. And it lasts for so long.
Right.
You see this incredibly intense grief, but it's tangled up with guilt, all those what ifs and could I have dones. Anger comes up, and then just this constant heavy sense of loss that can change a whole family dynamic. The analysis also points out how if there were already problems in the relationship, or a history of, say, domestic violence, or if the person just didn't have a strong support system, all of that adds to the stress.
It makes sense.
And increases the risk.
So it's this whole web of suffering that goes way beyond just one person.
Exactly.
And what about the effects on the community as a whole?
Well, when a suicide happens in a community, it can really shake that sense of connection and trust that people have.
Right.
It creates this almost like an unease, people feeling less safe.
I see.
And sadly, the AI even talks about this thing called suicide contagion, where exposure to a suicide, especially for people who are already vulnerable or in tight-knit groups, like a school, can actually increase the risk of more suicides. It's really complex and concerning.
That is a very, very difficult thing to think about, just how connected we all are in that way.
Yeah.
And of course, different cultures see death and suicide in completely different ways.
Right.
So how does culture come into play here?
Culture is huge in how we understand and deal with suicide. I mean, it's our norms, our beliefs about death and what comes after, even whether different methods are like accessible or acceptable in that culture. All of that can change the suicide rates, how people might attempt it. And a big point that AI makes is about stigma.
Yeah.
Across so many cultures, there's this huge stigma around mental health and suicide.
It's true.
And that stops people from getting help. They're afraid to be judged.
It's a huge barrier.
It really is.
And then you have the very real pressures of just like living, right? Money, jobs, all of that. How does economics play into this?
Economic hardship is a massive stressor, no doubt. The analysis points to joblessness, poverty, just overall financial instability as things that really crank up stress levels and can increase suicide risk. That weight of financial burdens, the fear of not providing for yourself or your family, it creates this hopelessness that can feel like there's no way out.
Like you're trapped.
Exactly.
It's really striking how it's not just an individual struggle, but it's tied into these bigger social, cultural, economic forces.
It's all interconnected.
Let's step back in time now.
Yeah.
The AI mentioned that suicide isn't new.
No, not at all.
What can we learn from looking at its presence throughout history?
The thing that blew my mind was realizing that virtually every civilization, every culture we have records of, they all have documentation of suicide.
Wow.
You see it in ancient texts, archaeological finds, literature.
It's everywhere.
But how we've understood it, how societies have reacted, that's changed so much over time.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's been shaped by religion, philosophy, and medicine.
Right.
Like the AI points out, there were times when suicide was this huge taboo, a sin, even a crime against the state.
Oh, wow.
But then you have other periods, other cultures where it was seen differently, maybe as an act of honor, sacrifice, even a rational choice when faced with unbearable suffering. So our current understanding is just one snapshot in this long history of how humans have grappled with this.
It really puts it in perspective.
Yeah.
So let's dive into some biology now. What did the AI have to say about genetics and the biological factors involved?
Well, first, it's clear there's no single suicide gene you inherit.
Okay.
But your genes can influence how likely you are to develop mental health disorders. And things like impulsivity.
I see.
Since those are risk factors, that creates this indirect genetic link. And research definitely suggests there's a hereditary component to a lot of the mental illnesses we talked about earlier.
Right.
So some people are just biologically more vulnerable.
Okay, that makes sense. And then what about the stuff happening in the brain, like right in the moment of crisis?
Biologically, the analysis highlights these imbalances in neurotransmitters. Those are the chemicals in your brain, like serotonin and dopamine.
Right, the mood chemicals.
Exactly. They control mood, sleep, appetite.
Yeah, yeah.
It also points to actual changes in the structure and function of certain brain areas.
Oh, interesting.
Particularly the parts that deal with mood regulation, decision-making, controlling impulses. And we can't forget about chronic stress, the impact that has on your body. High levels of stress hormones, that's another big piece of the puzzle.
It's all connected. So we've got our genes, we've got what's happening in our brains right now.
Right.
It's all contributing to someone's vulnerability.
Exactly.
Okay, now, for some maybe less obvious connections, how does suicide tie into things like philosophy, physics, math, logic? This is where it gets really interesting to me.
Yeah, this is where it gets deep. Philosophically, suicide makes us face some really fundamental questions about human existence.
Like what?
Well, what's the meaning of life, even? What's the purpose of suffering? Do we have true autonomy?
Wow.
And then there's this huge ethical question of whether someone has the right to choose to end their life.
Big questions.
Huge. And different philosophical traditions, they see it in such different ways. Like existentialism, it's all about freedom and finding meaning in this like seemingly meaningless universe.
Okay.
And then you have philosophies that are just completely about the sanctity of life above all else.
Right, right.
Each one gives you a different lens to look at this incredibly human dilemma.
Yeah, those are questions people have been asking forever. What about physics? That seems like a weird connection.
I know, right?
Yeah.
But the AI makes this interesting metaphor. It says, think about all the pressure someone's under when they're having suicidal thoughts. Psychological pressure, social pressure, emotional pressure.
That's a lot of weight.
It is. And you can think of that as these forces acting on a system, almost like physical forces. And when those forces are just too intense, too constant, it can cause the system to fail.
Like breaking under pressure.
Exactly. In this case, the system is the human mind.
Oh, that's such a powerful image. Okay, so we've got philosophy, we've got physics. What about math? How does that come in?
Well, math, especially epidemiology, that's the study of patterns in health and disease, it gives us tools to study suicide rates.
Okay.
We can spot patterns, risk factors, predict trends in different populations, different places, different times. Statistical analysis helps us find those connections between things like, you know, social stuff, economics, health factors, and how common suicide is.
Yeah. Right.
Like finding those strong statistical links between certain mental health diagnoses and suicide risk.
Right.
That's been huge for prevention efforts.
That makes sense. But I guess math can only tell you so much.
Right. And that's a really key point that AI makes.
Oh.
Math can show us the big picture trends, the correlations, but it can't capture that individual experience, the pain someone's going through.
Right. The numbers can't feel.
They can't. Okay, last one. Logic. This is one I've always wondered about. How can something that seems so irrational to us on the outside make sense to the person going through it? This is a big one. From the outside, suicide often seems completely irrational.
Yeah.
But for the person struggling, their thinking can feel so logical, like it's the only way to end the pain.
I can see that.
But here's the thing. The analysis points out that this logic is often distorted.
Okay.
It comes from those cognitive biases we talked about, that super narrow view of reality they're stuck in.
So it's logic, but it's based on a messed up view of things.
Exactly. And objectively, suicide often happens because of things that could be treated, problems that could be solved. But their logic tells them death is the only escape.
Because they can't see those other options.
Right. It's like their logic is based on this false idea that there's no other way out of the pain.
So their logic makes sense to them, but it's missing crucial information.
That's a really good way to put it.
This is all so heavy, but it's so important to understand. Let's talk about that inner world now.
Yeah.
What does the AI say about what's going on in the mind of someone thinking about suicide? Like, what's their state of mind? What are their beliefs?
The analysis points to this trifecta of feelings, hopelessness, but like profound hopelessness, feeling totally helpless, and just crushing despair.
It's like a recipe for disaster.
It really is. People in this state, they feel completely trapped. Like the suffering will never, ever end. And they see their own life, their future, in this totally distorted way.
They can't see any good.
Right. It's incredibly hard for them to even imagine that things could get better or that there are other solutions to the pain.
So their world shrinks and they feel alone.
Exactly. Utterly alone.
Awful. And how do their beliefs play into all of this? Like their beliefs about life and death, their place in the world?
Well, someone's belief system, whether it's from religion, culture, or just their own personal views,
Yeah.
that can have a huge influence on how they view suicide.
Right.
Some beliefs might condemn it totally.
Like it's wrong, morally.
Yeah, morally or spiritually wrong. Others might have different interpretations, or in some very specific cultural situations, they might even condone it.
Okay.
But what's crucial is how someone sees themselves.
Mm.
Do they believe they have worth? Do they feel like their life has a purpose? Do they feel connected to others?
Those are such fundamental things.
They are. A strong sense of purpose and connection, this can be really protective.
They can be like armor almost.
Yeah, in a way.
Okay, let's bring it back to that human level now.
Okay.
How does this affect the individuals themselves and those closest to them?
Well, for the person considering suicide, like we've been saying, it's often this desperate attempt to escape pain.
Right.
Pain that feels unbearable, like it'll never end.
Yeah.
Their world gets so small, they're isolated, and their thinking gets clouded by these intense emotions.
Right, like they can't think straight.
Exactly. They might honestly believe they're a burden to everyone.
And that dying will help.
Yeah, that their death will bring relief.
Just a horrible situation all around. And for those left behind, the families, the friends.
The impact is just devastating. It's this wave of emotions. Shock, disbelief.
Yeah.
Then intense grief, guilt, that if only I had done something, feeling, and then just this deep helplessness. They might spend years trying to understand why.
It's like a wound that never heals.
In a way, and the emotional toll, it's immense, often needing specialized support to even begin to cope.
It's just heartbreaking. Okay, so given all of this, how's the world reacting to this crisis? What are people doing?
Thankfully, there's this growing recognition of suicide as a global public health issue.
Like people are finally waking up to it.
Yeah, it's getting more urgent attention. And there's action on a lot of fronts. You see public health campaigns trying to raise awareness to break down that stigma so people will get help. There's a push for better access to mental health care.
Therapy, medication, all of that.
All of it, and especially crisis support, having that available right away.
That immediate help.
Exactly. And they're working on prevention strategies at every level, individual, community, even society-wide, targeting those risk factors we talked about.
Yep.
And research is huge, trying to understand what causes this, what the risk factors are.
So we can stop it.
Exactly. That research leads to better ways to prevent it. And then, really importantly, people are realizing we need to support those who've lost someone to suicide.
Yeah, the survivors.
Yes. They face unique challenges.
It's like a whole other layer of the tragedy.
It really is. So progress is happening, but like we said before, there are still big hurdles.
Right. What are some of the main things still on the way?
Stigma, unfortunately. In many parts of the world, it's still a massive barrier. It stops people from reaching out, isolates those who are suffering.
Because they're shamed.
Exactly. And just not knowing the warning signs, not knowing where to get help.
That lack of awareness is huge.
It is. We've got work to do.
Okay, so let's talk solutions. Based on what the AI found and what research is showing, what are some things that could really make a difference?
Stopping suicide, it takes this multi-pronged approach, hitting it from all angles.
Okay.
The analysis really highlights some key areas. First one, we've got to get better at identifying and treating mental health disorders early on.
Like before it gets to that crisis point.
Exactly. That means more access to affordable, good quality mental health services, really tackling that stigma so people aren't afraid to ask for help.
Yeah.
And early intervention programs.
Like catching it when it's starting.
Exactly. And making sure people can get therapy, medication, and just ongoing support. That's key.
Okay, so that's step one. What else?
Another big one is reducing access to lethal means. So things like firearms, certain medications, especially for those who are already at higher risk.
Taking away the tools.
In a sense, yeah. It's about making it harder to act impulsively.
That makes sense. What about those social connections we talked about?
Oh, that's huge. We need to strengthen those support networks, build a sense of community so people don't feel so alone.
Right, like they belong.
Exactly. And working to reduce social isolation. That's a big risk factor.
And what about just, like, helping people cope better in general?
That's crucial, too. We need to teach people how to handle stress, how to get through tough times.
Right, build that resilience.
Exactly. And we can't forget about the bigger picture stuff.
Like the social and economic problems.
Right. We need to address things like poverty, unemployment, discrimination, violence. All of that contributes to stress in society.
And when society is stressed, individuals are stressed.
Exactly. And then even how the media reports on suicide, that matters. We need responsible reporting that doesn't sensationalize it and actually gives people information on where to get help.
So it doesn't trigger anyone.
Right. And of course, having those crisis hotlines, text lines, emergency services.
I got immediate help.
That's vital. And finally, supporting those who've lost someone to suicide.
Right.
Providing resources, understanding.
That post-vention stuff is so important.
It is. It helps them heal, and it can even help prevent future tragedies.
It's like we need all hands on deck.
We do. It's a massive problem that needs a massive effort.
Okay, before we wrap up, let's talk about data and logic again. You know, those calculations, those deductions, how do they fit into this whole picture?
So there's no magic formula to explain why someone chooses to end their life.
Right, it's too complex.
Way too complex. But data analysis, looking at all those statistics, that's crucial.
Okay.
It helps us see the patterns, the trends, those key risk factors.
Across all sorts of groups.
Exactly. Different demographics, time periods, locations, like finding that strong link between major depression and suicide risk. That's come from data analysis, and it helps inform prevention.
Makes sense. And what about analyzing those risk factors?
That's where we figure out how likely different factors are to contribute.
Okay.
Like a history of attempts, substance abuse, isolation.
Yeah.
It helps us identify those who might be at higher risk and get them the right support.
Targeted intervention.
Exactly. And even things like cost-benefit analysis can help us figure out which prevention programs work best.
So we're using resources wisely.
Right. Now, we talked about how the logic of suicidal thinking can be distorted.
Yeah.
But understanding how our brains can make these logical leaps, even when they're based on faulty information, that helps us understand the process.
So even though the logic is flawed, it still makes sense in a way.
Yeah, within that person's distorted reality, it makes sense, like feeling like a burden.
Right.
That can feel so logical, so real, even if it's not based on the full picture.
So we need to understand both the big picture data and the intensely personal experience.
We need both. It's a complex puzzle.
So as we come to the end of this deep dive into suicide, what's the one thing you want listeners to walk away with?
I want them to understand that suicide is not a simple act. It's not a weakness.
Yeah.
It's this profound tragedy that happens when someone can't cope anymore and they just can't see any other way out.
And it's not their fault.
No. It's been around forever, and it affects us all, individually and as societies.
We all have a stake in this.
We do. It needs our compassion, our understanding, and our action.
Very well said. And as our listeners process all of this, what's one last thought you want to leave them with?
Think about how connected we all are, how our individual well-being is tied to what's happening in our communities and society as a whole. We all have a role to play in building a world where people feel hope, where they get support without judgment, where we understand mental health better.
What can we each do to make that happen?
That's the question I want everyone asking. What small but meaningful actions can we take? Because even small things can make a difference.
And those small things add up.
They really do. It's about creating a world where suffering like this doesn't have to happen.
It's a beautiful thought to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on the Deep Dive today.
It's been my pleasure.
And to all our listeners, remember, you're not alone. There's help out there, and there's always hope.
This is DigitView.